What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're here for a quick review slash analysis of Evelina by Frances Burney. Should be pretty interesting. Hope you guys will be interested or enchanted to read this novel. Make sure you guys follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Send me an email at andrewmarlowe22@gmail.com. Make sure you guys check out the playlist. We have several ones that are curated towards literature, book reviews, as well as body positivity. I used to make a lot of videos about plus size women and stuff like that. So if you guys are interested in that, please feel free to check that out. So we did finally finish this. It feels like I've been reading this for like 6 months or a year. I don't know why. It was a bit tiresome, and we'll talk a little bit about why. And as I was reading this, it was hard for me to appreciate it, but as I started kind of doing the research behind the book and the social context, the social culture, and the history of Evelina and Frances Burney, I kind of was able to appreciate it a little bit more. But partially, there is a barrier due to the language. Now, this is sort of what is known as an epistolary novel, which basically means it's told through letters. So it's very formal. Now, this was published in 1778, I want to say. Let me just double check that, if I may. Okay, so 1778. So we're going way back. And what's interesting about this is it's a really good precursor. It's sort of a proto Jane Austen type thing. You know, if you're thinking about reading Pride and Prejudice or any of the Jane Austen stuff, or even fast forwarding to some of the Charlotte Bronte type stuff, or even like, you know, some of the Edith Wharton type stuff, you should definitely prepare yourself and kind of rewind and go to Frances Burney first, because Frances Burney was, I don't want to say the first, but she was definitely one of the, you know, sort of the pioneers of sort of this female proto-feminist literature, right? And that's sort of what we get with Evelina. Now, I'm not going to do a whole rundown of the plot because the plot is fairly convoluted and very complex. I don't say convoluted to denigrate the writing or the plot or anything, but let's rewind back slightly to what I was talking about a minute ago. There is a barrier because of the epistolary writing. The writing is very formalized. It's very old-fashioned. This was published pre-1800s, okay, ladies and gentlemen? So this is, you know, a little bit difficult to swallow. If you're not ready, if you've never read anything from that time period, maybe you're familiar with Jane Austen or Charlotte Bronte, or maybe Wuthering Heights. Even those things are rather difficult to swallow. But even just the opening, you know, paragraph here, this is a woman named Lady Howard who's writing to the Reverend Mr. Villars. Now, the Reverend Mr. Villars is sort of the caretaker, sort of the adopted father of the protagonist, Evelina. Now, Evelina has been sort of placed in the Reverend Villars' care because Evelina's mother is dead, and she sort of had a scandalous relationship with Evelina's father. And I guess they sort of had a falling out, or she sort of eloped. Evelina's mother rather eloped with Evelina's father. His name is, it's in here somewhere. I'm not real good at remembering names, but his name is in here. What is his damn name? We'll get to his name later. I would like to find out what his damn name is, though, so we could follow suit here. But anyway, so she's got a father, but he does not recognize Evelina as his daughter. So she's sort of like a bastard daughter, if that's kind of a thing. But anyway, this is the opening page, just to get you guys a little acquainted with the difficulty of the language. Can there, my good sir, be anything more painful to a friendly mind than a necessity of communicating disagreeable intelligence? Question mark. Indeed, it is sometimes difficult to determine whether the relator or the receiver of evil tidings is most to be pitied. So a lot of this will take rereading, but like people have pointed out, some of it, when you're dealing with really complex literature, hopefully most of it, or at least some of it, should be fluid pre-knowledge, but you're not going to always have fluid pre-knowledge when you're picking up random books. There's just so many things to read. There's so much information to retain. Sometimes you're just going out on a limb and exploring something new, as you should, and you're not going to have a lot of pre-knowledge. So basically, the story kind of starts with this lady. It has a preface, sort of putting the whole. Well, it actually starts with a poem. I'm not sure who wrote the poem, but it starts with a poem, and then there's what's known as "To the authors of the monthly and critical reviews." I think it's sort of a little satire. I think this entire book is supposed to be kind of funny, but we'll talk about some of the difficulty that arises from that. And then there's a preface. Now, this novel is told in first person, even though it's epistolary. So each letter is told mostly through Evelina's point of view, the protagonist, but some of the letters are also told through, obviously, the other character's point of view. And what's cool about this edition, it has all the original illustrations. Now, I'm not sure what the actual illustrations have to do with the actual novel. It doesn't really say, but I'm assuming, like, for example, Belmont, that's one of the main characters as well. So Lady Howard is sort of writing to Reverend Mr. Villers, sort of attempting to get Evelina's father to accept, trying to get Evelina's father to get him to accept Evelina as his daughter, but it's unknown how there's no way to really legitimize it until we get to the end. We'll try to talk a little bit about that at the end. So basically, in the meantime, the Reverend Mr. Villers, Evelina's caretaker, or sort of her pseudo father, her adopted father, I guess you could say, basically sends her to London to try to jumpstart her entrance into society. He doesn't want to hold her back forever, and he's trying to maybe, speed up the process to get her, sort of fast forward her to sort of a social status, perhaps, to a place where her father would maybe more likely accept her, perhaps. Maybe that's the way I'm reading it. So she was, I put here, background of the main characters and the orphan Evelina. She's not exactly an orphan, but she's kind of like a pseudo orphan, because her father, she knows who her father is, I believe. I could be wrong about that. And he obviously knows who she is, but he doesn't really recognize her, right? So she goes to London and basically tries to, not in a narcissistic way by any means, but she's sort of trying to decipher the complex mazes of the social hierarchy of London. Also, she goes to other places. And something else to keep in mind, London during 1778 through, the 1750s to the 1800s or whatever, there were political and sort of religious struggles between France and England. There obviously there was a war between France and England. I'm not sure exactly when it took place, but there's a lot of snobbery between the French and the English. They don't particularly like each other, and that comes up in this novel and some of the characters. So we have a little bit of that taking place in here, and we see that manifested in some of the characters. But also, in a nutshell, before we sort of start breaking down some of the events, like I said, we're not going to dissect the plot and talk about every single event, but I am going to sort of brush up on my notes and just kind of briefly discuss them. We talked a little bit about the proto-feminism. We talked about how you can approach this as sort of an introduction or a little segue into Jane Austen, perhaps, or Charlotte Bronte or some of those other writers. Now, I've always kind of looked upon these female sort of writers, these early feminist writers, as sort of boring and sort of provincial, but there's actually a lot of really interesting content here. And what's kind of interesting about it is the way that they humorously write about the struggles of women. right? It's not the sort of overly woke Marxist sort of approach that we see today. Women holding, signs, in a mob of blue-haired Marxist feminists like we would get today, screaming obscenities. It's much classier. Women actually had to write and to intellectually dissect and analyze their thoughts and get published and actually, do something about their, concerns and their lack of rights other than just scream and throw things at people. So I think there's something to be said for that, and we get a lot of that with Frances Burney. It's basically a manifesto of how, you could maybe even hesitate and not even call it a feminist manifesto, because it's kind of way before feminism was even a thing, but it's definitely sort of proto-feminism. But it's more about the social classes of women in England, sort of versus France, or the social class of women and French women. But it's not really about French women. Obviously, it takes place in England, mostly in Bristol and places like that. But it's about how a woman sort of, what does it mean to be a classy woman? What does it mean to be a successful woman? And what does it mean to have a woman's identity in the context of sort of a repressive social class? And how does a woman go about finding herself, finding her own identity in a situation like this where your own father doesn't want to recognize you? And how does a woman come to terms with not depending too much on the success of a male suitor? We'll talk about the male suitors that she comes across in this novel, and also the ability of a woman to sort of forge her own path. Having said that, how much can a woman really forge her own path if she's destitute financially, if she doesn't have a good title to her name financially and sort of socially? Evelina does have a good intro, sort of a good name to sort of introduce herself into this English society, but she's sort of being manipulated almost like a piece on a chessboard by all these other manipulative narcissistic characters. And it's just a really interesting story. But I will say the language is hard to get into, and you cannot speed read this. I had a troll in my comment section the other day that said I should be reading 150 to 200 pages of Marcel Proust, à la recherche de temps perdus, every day, and that's just simply not possible. I can't imagine how much of Evelina they think I should read a day. But I've never claimed to be a master scholar, and I'm not an English major. I read things that I think are interesting, and I try to read them as in depth and as not slowly as possible, but because I'm not a slow reader, but I'm not a speed reader either, so I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. And I don't think you can really get anything out of something by speed reading it. We're not reading anime or good reads here. We're reading really heavy, in-depth, difficult classic novels, and this is one of them. I did not know this was going to be as difficult as it was, and in reality it's not super difficult, but it is rather difficult because the plot is very complex. There's a lot of different characters, and you have to do a decent amount of research on the social situation, sort of going into it in order to kind of appreciate it. And you can kind of do it in different orders. Like I kind of picked this up not really knowing anything about the social, history of England and France, and this is also known as sort of a sentimental epistolary novel, sort of like Pride and Prejudice, and all those Jane Austen type novels. But this is kind of where it all started. So let's sort of stop ranting here, and we'll get into the plot a little bit. And some of the interesting characters. So basically, Evelina makes her way to London, and she's sent to Howard Grove, and this lady named Mrs. Clinton kind of goes along with her. And she was, like I said, she was formerly in the care of Arthur Villers. I think that was the Reverend Villers we discussed. And now sort of all of a sudden, all this crazy stuff kind of starts to happen. Now, on the letters from Evelina's point of view don't actually start taking place till page 25, as you can see there. All the letters before that are from Miss Mervyn and Lady Howard and Mr. Villers and all these other characters. But on page 25, we start to get an understanding of Evelina's point of view. So on page 31, I wrote Evelina experiences shopping, wealth, high society, and the attention of men. And that's another underlying theme to be aware of in this universe of Evelina, is the sort of overbearing masculine attention that women were subjected to during this time. It's, you know, that, and I guess they're still subjected to in modern times. That's something to, as a male reader, that was an interesting experience. It's almost like you're a woman right along with her, and you're sort of being catcalled. You're being sort of harassed and coerced, just as a woman would. Now, I don't think that's obviously every woman's experience, God forbid, but you do get a sense of that, and we're rewinding all the way back to the 1700s, mind you, where there were even less social morals and stuff like that, that, you know, would have sort of, there was not as many restraints on male behavior. But having said that, what's also sort of humorous about this tale is that as Evelina is working her way up the echelons of the supposed elite society, there's a lot of really raunchy, disrespectful men, and it sort of goes to show you, that's one of the underlying themes of the novel, is that no matter how classy somebody is, their social status or their financial situation does not dictate their behavior, or vice versa, right? So we have that. So and then she meets this wonderful gentleman named Lord Orville, and he's a really nice suitor for her. He's real wealthy, supposedly. He's real classy. He kind of starts seducing her, and Evelina really takes to this guy, but she sort of becomes disillusioned because she doesn't know who her father, you know, she's been sort of outcasted by her father, sort of abandoned. So she starts to pull back because she feels like she's not worthy. So we have this whole series of events where she sort of is courting him. They're flirting. They're sort of falling in love. But she sort of starts to pull back because she's having a lot of self-esteem issues due to her upbringing, sort of her mother being dead. Evelina lacks a real strong, even though she has the potential and she has sort of a really strong elite heritage. Her father is a very wealthy person, you know, or at least close to the upper echelons of society. They're not like kings and queens and upper royalty, but they're pretty classy fellas, you know, ladies, and, you know, pretty classy fellas and ladies and stuff like that. But Evelina is always second guessing herself, basically, in a nutshell. So basically, Evelina goes to see King Lear, and this is kind of when there's a lot of references to old plays, which is really cool. We hear a lot about Shakespeare. We hear a lot about ancient Greek tragedies, Roman tragedies, stuff like that. And so she has another interaction with Lord Orville, and we start to get the sort of this, maybe the pseudo-sexual awakening of Evelina, which is kind of interesting. It says here, I cannot but be hurt at the opinion he entertains of me. It is true, my own behavior incurred it, yet he is himself the most agreeable and seemingly the most amiable man in the world, and therefore it is that I am grieved to be thought ill of him. For of whose esteem ought we to be ambitious, if not of those who most merit our own? So a lot of this stuff, like I said, will take rereading. I would love to reread this. I'm probably not going to do it right away. I will probably put it on the bookshelf maybe for another 6 months, and then I probably will take it down and dissect it again. There's some other books I want to move on to. So just some interesting things like the Fantinoci, which is an old puppet show, a little comedy in French and Italian. The show is put on by puppets, so admirably managed that they both astonish and divert us all except the captain. So, and I sort of wrote here, the puppet show is a possible metaphor for how Evelina is feeling, right? Because she's sort of like a puppet or a pawn in sort of this little puppet pawn show. And all these elites are sort of just playing little mind games with her and stuff like that. Now, here we have sort of this really sort of not very likable character. I believe her name is Madame Duval, the grandmother of your Evelina. Now, when Madame Duval comes into this story, nobody really likes her that I'm aware of. And as a reader, you don't really like her, but you kind of like her in sort of as sort of a bitter, old, resentful grandmother type character. And she gives Evelina a heck of a horrible time and starts to micromanage Evelina's life and takes her on all these escapades. And then we sort of start to see the prejudice come out between towards English people from France. There's a lot of French characters that come here, and there is some French in here. Monsieur de Bois and you know, a lot of Dubois and Sir Clement Willoughby, and so but there's a lot of social tensions between the French and the English, and the French social circle surrounding Evelina is trying to sabotage Evelina's French connections or her French friends, sort of, and most of that is coming from Madame Duval. Madame Duval wants to make sure that Evelina holds resentments towards French people and French society just as much as Madame Duval does herself. So then she goes to see another play called Love for Love. They're sort of gallivanting Evelina all around town, taking her to all these elite plays and all this kind of stuff. So also, what's also really interesting about this, I wrote this in my notes, we have the male perception of women's moods, appearance, and feminine virtue. So this book is definitely focused 100% on the battle of the sexes, almost like you would get with War and Peace with Leo Tolstoy. You know, the constant dating, the constant relationship struggles, the constant breakups. You know, it's almost like a Bukowskian tale sort of told through the eyes of a woman. And what's really great about this is that it sort of humorously depicts the buffoonery, the buffoonish behavior of men, but it doesn't really demonize men. We have some really, really nice male protagonists. We have some sort of male antagonists. And then we also have reactions of female characters in the play. And we sort of have that Shakespearean nod to Shakespeare, sort of when they go to see a play. So there's sort of like a play within a play within a play. So the characters sort of live vicariously and discover different aspects of themselves through the manifestations of what they're seeing on the stage before them. You understand what I'm saying? So that's kind of what we're dealing with. And I wrote down here, this is kind of a Marxist term, but we have some toxic masculinity, male ego versus stoicism. I'm not going to read too much from the text because I feel like that it just gets too long-winded. You guys have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. I feel like my own commentary kind of speaks for itself. Also here we have a strong emphasis and concern for social codes, morals, gender roles, elite societies, and stuffiness. There's a lot of stuffiness in here. There's a lot of he said, she said. There's a lot of, oh, you're not from this part of England, then you're no good. You're not part of this part of France, then you're no good. And we also have some references just to again, Evelina desires independence from Madame Duval and her chaperones. So they're kind of, think of a very, very overbearing grandmother. That's basically what Madame Duval is. And then Madame Duval basically tries to come up with this whole scheme. I forgot exactly what it is, but it's sort of a legal scheme to try to get Evelina somehow to buy off her father's inheritance or something along those lines. I forgot exactly what it is. Maybe we'll try to explain it here. And then there's this really other character named Sir Clement, and I believe he is sort of the antagonist, I want to say. I could be wrong about that, but he's basically this guy that's hitting on her nonstop. She doesn't like him, and he's very obnoxious, and sort of that's where we sort of get into the realm of proto-toxic masculinity, right? Now, we also have this theme here. I might read a little bit of this. This is Lord Orville talking here. Far be it from me, said Lord Orville, to dispute the magnetic power of beauty, which irresistibly draws and attracts whatever has soul and sympathy. And I am happy to acknowledge that though we have now no gods to occupy a mansion professedly built for them, you hear that quote? No gods to occupy a mansion professedly built for them, yet we have secured their better halves, for we have goddesses to whom we are all most willingly bow down. And then, with a very droll air, he made a profound reference to the ladies. They need be goddesses with a vengeance, said the captain, for they're mortal dear to look at. However, see, I've never heard that word either. House moreover. Let me see if I can get that a little clearer on the print here, on the screen. House moreover. House moreover. You know what I mean? People like to troll me, but I've never read words like this before. House moreover. I guess it's like moreover or however. I should be glad to know what you can see. And the reason I'm stumbling over this, guys, is because when you try to read it, like I can read it pretty fast in my head silently, but when you actually have to extrapolate it and read it, it becomes a challenge. Especially when they do this stuff, when they have, you can see an ear, like little things like that, little old, 17th century, 18th century English terms like that. Anyway, you can see an ear, a face among them that's worth half a guinea for a sight. So we're sort of have this duality of goddesses and the perception of women only being appreciated for their looks, but they're also considered beautiful as goddesses and that they're revered. So we sort of have the struggle of masculinity and where do men fall in their acceptance of their own sexuality and their own viewpoints. And how do they control their own sexuality in terms of how they interact with women, right? Women as objects of desire versus lofty goddesses. So I kind of put that in there. Then we have Mr. Villers. He obviously sympathizes with Evelina's struggles. And Mr. Villers is kind of like Evelina's rock. And he's a real sort of, I guess it's because he's a reverend perhaps, but he's a very sort of traditional person. And he's like the therapist of the novel. He's like the voice of reason for Evelina and also some of the other characters. Everybody kind of unloads on poor Mr. Villers, right? He kind of hears everybody's woes and everybody's sorrows. So he's kind of a likable character, I would say, I think. So on page 132, we have sort of Evelina's background and context. I'm not going to go over it. But everybody says what a beautiful, lovely representation of her mother she is. So then we have this really funny kind of scene where Madame Duval, these male characters, I think it's, who is it? The captain, Sir Clement, and possibly Lord Orville. I don't think Lord Orville was involved, but he might have been. But anyway, they're taking a carriage ride, and some of the male characters that are involved with Evelina, everybody is so sick of Lady Duval, right, or Madame Duval, so they plot to sort of kidnap and hijack the carriage ride, the horse and buggy. There's these really beautiful, funny scenes of just these women riding back and forth into the countryside, and you become really immersed in it. And sometimes it's a little bit provincial, it's a little bit boring, but you have to really immerse yourself. This is a very demanding novel. It demands a lot of your time and a lot of your attention. Like I said, you cannot speed read it. Some of these pages you will have to go over several times to really get the gist of what they're saying. Number one, because there's a language barrier. I don't mean in translation, but I mean in the time period. They talk differently, they wrote differently back then, and also there's a cultural barrier, not only as an American, but, trying to decipher the cultural barrier of almost 400-year-old English society. But there's also just the political and social culture of that time period, which is quite a bit different from the one we're living in now. But in some ways, it's not really that different. And that's a beautiful thing about literature, is that it shows you the similarities that you have with people throughout the centuries. I think that's a beautiful part of it. So anyway, the carriage is robbed, and they basically accost Madame Duval and make an example out of her, and she's freaked out, and she's like this sort of accosted old lady, and she goes on this rant. Sir Clement, so Sir Clement, I think I was right about that earlier when we referenced that character that was accosting Evelina. I forgot who we said, but anyway, it's Sir Clement. Sir Clement is the guy that's been kind of harassing Evelina. We're not talking about Lord Orville, the nice guy. We're talking about Sir Clement. And Sir Clement basically has to, rid herself or Evelina has to rid herself of Sir Clement. And then I wrote victim blaming here. And we hear that a lot nowadays too, with sort of the Me Too movement and all this kind of stuff. And Sir Clement is basically victim blaming Evelina. And he's saying, woe is me, you're rejecting me. And And that's a thing that men get blamed for a lot, right? Because men, we have trouble containing our emotions, especially in the realm of rejection. We're not very good at it. And this is something that Evelina, or Frances Burney rather, points out rather well for us in this magnificent novel. So, and I did point this out too. The four main characters in this novel are pretty much, obviously, Evelina, Madame Duval, Monsieur Dubois, Miss Brangton, and Sir Clement, and as well as Lord Orville. So those are just some people to kind of keep in your periphery. Then we have a reference to Orpheus and Eurydice, old Greek tragedy, I believe. So I wrote this here: novel as a social commentary of plight. Novel as a social commentary of the plight of women being accosted in the realm of society. Looks like the mall of society. In the realm of society. So that's another thing you can take away from Evelina is sort of a, I don't want to say Me Too, but it is sort of a very heavily veiled account of the poor behavior of men accosting women in the 1700s society. That's definitely what it's about. And a woman's struggle to, women were sort of almost forced to act classy in those situations. They weren't allowed to act angry. They were often not taken seriously when they went to the authorities. So what was a woman to do? You know, it's a very interesting predicament to be in. So, and then on page 261, we're kind of getting towards the halfway point here. Evelina becomes disillusioned and confused by Lord Orville because of, she says here, you wonder, you say, since my heart takes no part in this affair, why it should make me so unhappy. And can you, acquainted as you are with the high opinion I entertained of Lord Orville, can you wonder that so great a disappointment in his character should affect me? Indeed, had so strange a letter been sent to me from anybody, it could not have failed shocking me how much more sensibly than I must feel such an affront. So it's, you know, just reading random pages, it's hard to kind of put it in context, and that's why I hesitate to read from the text. So she's sort of flirting with a plethora of different men. And there was a period of this book where I kind of stopped taking notes because I wanted to sort of get through it. And that's sort of whenever you encounter a novel like that, when you're resisting reading it, you're kind of rolling your eyes when you have to pick it up again. That's all the more reason to keep reading it. Do not give up. I wanted to throw this book across the room about a dozen times. I did not want to finish this because it was just, I had trouble relating to it. But I'm so glad that I finished it because I learned a little bit. There was a lot of really good Easter eggs and rabbit holes, and you know, there wasn't a lot of fluid pre-knowledge there, as the troll would say. But there was a lot of good rabbit holes for me to get into, and I took a lot away from this. So basically, by the time we get to the end, Evelina meets her father. She has this friend by the name of Miss Selwyn. Miss Sulin. She's a pretty likable character, Miss Selwyn, and she basically has some kind of elite connection to Evelina's father. And they arrive on Mrs. Beaumont's chariot, and they go to confront Evelina's father by the name of, what is his damn name? Sir John? I don't think that's his name. But anyway, there's this really emotional exchange where Evelina, now this is sort of complicated because Evelina's father has sort of another daughter that he thinks is her daughter, or that he thinks is his daughter, but that's not really his daughter. Or maybe it is his daughter, but he actually has another daughter, which is Evelina. But he doesn't think it's his daughter, and they have this really beautiful, I could read it to you, but it would just take like too long. But they have this beautiful emotional exchange, and Evelina's father breaks down in tears when he finally actually looks into his grown daughter's eyes, and he says something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing here, he says, well, actually, I'll read it to you guys. My God, does Caroline Evelyn still live? And he's referring to Evelina's mother. Lift up thy head. If my sight has not blasted thee, lift up thy head, thou image of my long-lost Caroline. So he's basically telling you that he sees his wife, his dead wife, in the likeness of his beautiful grown daughter. Yes, yes, cried he, looking earnestly in my face. I see thou art her child. She lives, she breathes, she is present to my view. O God, that she indeed lived. Go, child, go, added he, wildly starting and pushing me from him. Take her away, madame, and I cannot bear to look at her. And then breaking hastily from me, he rushed out of the room. So the guy basically has a nervous breakdown because he cannot handle this over-emotional family drama news all at once. And I think they sort of make somewhat of amends towards maybe the end. And then the novel drags on a little bit more. And then Evelina basically gets the green light to marry Lord Orville, and she kind of lives happily ever after, right? So it's a little bit, like I said, it's sentimental, it's provincial, and it's a little bit corny. It's a little bit hokey, and even the critics of Evelina during its time, and even up to the present day, have been sort of critical of the depiction of Evelina as this perfect, angelic sort of female protagonist. She doesn't really have any sort of shortcomings. You know, she's basically perfect. I mean, I would say she does have shortcomings, you know, because the whole novel is basically her stumbling and falling up the social hierarchy, and she has all this sort of family baggage. So I wouldn't say she's like a perfect protagonist by any means, but she does sort of have this, you know, overly perfect sort of perception from the male characters, and it's almost like she can do no wrong, right? So that's kind of my little quick, wasn't exactly quick, but that's sort of my little amateur sort of view of Frances Burney's Evelina. I think if I did another rereading and maybe did some more research, we could probably extrapolate quite a bit more out of it, but I would definitely say you could definitely read this before or after you read some Jane Austen type stuff. Supplement it with Jane Austen, perhaps. Do not forget about Frances Burney. You know, we hear a lot about Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte and stuff like, you know, George Eliot, but there's so many other really great writers too that have kind of been fallen to the wayside like Frances Burney. So thank you so much for watching, and we will talk to you guys next time.